Hello and thanks for joining us on Chicago Tonight. I'm Brandis Friedman. Here's what we're looking at. President Trump's sweeping spending bill becomes law with cuts to Medicaid, food assistance, and more. Reaction from local members of Congress. Where the fight for birthright citizenship stands after Supreme Court action. And a local entrepreneur is taking a bite out of Chicago's food scene, one chip at a time. First off tonight, President Donald Trump's sweeping tax and spending bill is now law after heated debate and narrowly passing Congress. While Republican backers say the plan will cut taxes, Democrats are sounding the alarm on cuts to social services. Over the next decade, the legislation would cut $930 billion to Medicaid and $186 billion to food and nutrition programs like SNAP. Joining us now with their reactions are Congressman Jonathan Jackson, a Democrat from Chicago, and on Zoom, Congressman Sean Casten, a Democrat from Downers Grove. We should mention we also invited all Republican members of the Illinois congressional delegation, but they either did not respond or declined. Congressman, we thank both of you for joining us. So this bill, as we mentioned, it finally passed Congress despite long debate, Democrats' efforts to stop the bill. Congressman Jackson, I'll start with you, please. What is your reaction to this new spending plan?
Oh, this is brutal. It's ugly. This is a transformative piece of legislation. I think people really haven't absorbed the magnitude. When you talk about lifting the debt ceiling by $5 trillion, expanding the federal deficit by $3.5 trillion, by passing off tax breaks of almost $3 trillion to the wealthiest people. There'll be some other smaller for people that are doing tips and things. And then what's offset by that is $1 trillion in Medicaid. We're talking about taking 42 million people that have food assistance that we're getting $6.20 to bringing them down to $4.80, where people are now having to have work requirements that were from 18 to 54 because life gets complicated as you get older, now pushing that up to 65 years of age. And so the thing of 80 able-bodied people without dependents, I asked one of my Republican colleagues on the Ag Committee, because I put a amendment in to stop it at the 54-year mark because there's already work requirements. And he says, but are they able-bodied? I said, what happens when your parents have a stroke and now your children are at their house, but you have to take care of your parents? Can your parents get on your insurance? Does that mean your parents are now your dependents? So it's just grossly mismanaged, and it's very hurtful to the common and working person in our society.
Congressman Casten, same question to you. What is your reaction to this bill becoming law?
You know, I think Jonathan's got it right. I mean, the fact of this bill is that if you're a billionaire, you have a private chef who prepares all your meals and a driver and your private doctor, you're going to like this bill because your taxes are going to go down and you don't have to worry about the healthcare system or the food system. If that doesn't describe you, you're probably worse off. The Republicans have described this as a tax cut, across the board. But the truth is, cutting a lot of the energy programs that we passed in the last term means that every American household is going to spend $400 more per year on energy on average. Cutting those costs to our health insurance system doesn't just hurt people who are on Medicaid, because we've got so many hospitals, especially in rural areas, I'd point out, that depend on Medicaid reimbursement. So if you take 17 million people off of the healthcare rolls, those hospitals now can't stay open. So you may have a great private health plan, but if that hospital's not open, or if you get there and the emergency room is full of folks who have been kicked off their insurance system, catching the one last part of the system that works, it's going to be your health that suffers. So for the vast majority of Americans, you will be sicker, you will be hungrier, you will be poorer, also that billionaires can get a tax cut. And I know Jonathan feels the same way. We left Washington thinking like, how do these people look their kids in the eye and say that they're proud of what they did last week?
So let's talk about those tax cuts. The bill brings $4.5 billion in more tax cuts. Republicans are saying that they are needed because Trump's tax cuts from his first term were set to expire. Congressman Casten, are there not some benefits, some provisions of this legislation that you might have supported, making permanent the tax cuts that were set to expire, not taxing tips and overtime, or expanding the child tax credit? Could these not have become bipartisan issues?
Look, we did a significant expansion of the child tax credit when the Democrats were in the majority. This is a fraction of that. Talking about tax on tips in the context of $5 trillion of deficits and billionaire tax cuts, I joked last week that this is sort of like somebody saying, I've got a, I've got a cake I made out of horse manure, but you're really going to like, but you're really going to like the eggs. Like we didn't get a choice to vote on these individually. This is a really toxic package that's bad for the American people. And whether there's one little thing that's small that's okay is really not the point. Um, and I'd point out that, when Trump passed this last tax cut bill, it blew up deficits. Saying that we need to continue that is, I'm not sure how. Trickle down economics doesn't work. It just leaves a future generation to pay the bills that we didn't have the courage to take care of.
Representative Jackson, there's also an extra $350 billion for the president's immigration crackdown. What does that mean for an area like Chicago, where the city has certainly been targeted by the president's immigrations and customs enforcement agencies' raids and deportations?
So now you're talking about increasing the ICE budget by over $100 billion cumulatively, with money that's been set aside for detention facilities, almost $50 billion. That alone, that $150 billion increase in the $45 billion for detention facilities, means that the ICE department can build detention / prison facilities. That's a larger budget than the Federal Bureau of Prisons. So there can be an enormous amount of people in there. This is a budget that's now, that was bigger than the USAID, the ICE budget, that was bigger than the loss to children and grants. This is bigger than the mental health. So all that's being stripped away. So I agree with Congressman Casten when you're like, what's lost? You don't see half of what's being lost. When they say you can raise your taxes and you can go cash free for $25,000 for those workers that have tips, but now you're no longer eligible for Medicaid. They're not telling you the whole story.
You yourself, you tried to investigate ICE facilities in Broadview and the South Loop. You were turned away last month in your efforts to conduct oversight. How does this larger ICE budget impact future efforts to hold the agency accountable and to conduct that oversight?
Well, you've got the military that's on the ground in Los Angeles. You've got ICE now going across the country. You've got ICE, or these group of men. We don't know who they are because they're unmarked vehicles. They don't show their badges. They don't show their face. They won't give you their name. And you can see a woman being kidnapped. You can see a child being kidnapped. We're just saying this is indecent, pulling somebody away. If people are coming in, they're properly reporting, they're going through the process, we're saying give peace a chance. Now we don't know about the safety and security of women. What am I supposed to do, stand here and see a woman becoming abducted? I was fulfilling my congressional obligation and responsibility to go visit a federal facility. I was denied access to that. So now you've seen a judge being arrested by ICE officials, you've seen a congressional woman, you've seen a mayor, you've seen a United States senator thrown to the ground. He is actively putting the president, pitting law enforcement against legislators. That's what we have to look forward to, and that's wrong, and it's going to get violent.
Representative Casten, Democrats were campaigning hard against this bill, trying to pull enough no votes from Republicans, which obviously there were not enough of for you all. Is there something to be said about the Democrats' messaging around this bill, whether it made a difference for voters, constituents, enough to call their Republican congressman?
This bill was really unpopular a month ago. It's still really unpopular today. I think that the harder question to answer is, why did Republicans vote for something that they know is unpopular? We know that the Republican Party has told their members not to do town halls at home because they're getting yelled at by their constituents. I can tell you from personal experience, because I went down and did town halls in Darren LaHood's district and Mike Boss' district. The folks down there are really angry about what it means if they lose a rural hospital and want to know why their representative isn't showing up. I think what's hard, could we have done a better job of persuading Republicans? I don't know. I mean, we had a lot of them who said it is a line in the sand for me. I'm not going to vote on something that raises deficits. We had a number of them who said it's a line in the sand for me. I'm not going to do something that cuts Medicaid. We had a lot of them who said it's a line in the sand. I'm not going to do something that cuts these clean energy incentives that are helping my district. And yet, with the exception of Brian Fitzpatrick and Thomas Massey, they all rolled. And so I think what's hard for Jonathan and I going back, not because we're Democrats, but if you work with someone and they give you your word that this is important to me and I will fight for it, and then they give up because the president says to do it. I find myself wondering, are we a co-equal branch or not? Are we capable of leadership, or are we just here to do what other people tell us to do? Because I don't think that's the job description, but it's what a lot of my colleagues did last week.
Okay, that's where we'll have to leave it. We look forward to having both of you gentlemen back on in the future to keep talking about these issues. Congressman Jonathan Jackson, Congressman Sean Casten, thanks to you both.
Thank you, Brandis.
Thank you.
Coming up, what's next for birthright citizenship after a recent Supreme Court ruling?
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by the Alexandra and John Nichols family, the Jim and Kay Mabee family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
The Supreme Court has recently made decisions on several controversial cases, including one dealing with birthright citizenship. While the High Court avoided making a ruling on whether President Trump's executive order ending birthright citizenship is constitutional, the justice's ruling in that case, which stops nationwide injunctions, has created uncertainty. Joining us now with more are Chuck Hernandez, chairman of the Chicago Republican Party and a former detective with the Chicago Police Department, and on Zoom, Ed Yonka, communications director of the ACLU. Gentlemen, thanks to you both for joining us. Ed, I want to start with you, please. Remind us what this Supreme Court ruling means, because as we said, it was not a decision on the merits of birthright citizenship and the executive order. What did this ruling decide?
That's right, Brandis. What the Supreme Court ruled on was the technical question as to whether or not a single district court judge in a judicial district across the country could make a ruling that would effectively block application of the president's, in this case, his order around birthright citizenship all across the country. This has been an issue that's been debated on both sides for a number of years as to whether or not these national injunctions issued by district court judges were appropriate. I think oftentimes you saw people either support or complain about these orders, depending on whether or not they supported or opposed the underlying issue. But in fact, there has never been a court yet that has ruled that the order that the president issued on his first day in office that sought to rewrite the 14th Amendment is in fact constitutional.
So then what is next, Ed, for those states that are challenging this order?
Well, I think that's where it gets a little bit complicated and a little bit frightening, indeed, in some ways, which is that within the next few weeks, the Supreme Court said that the president's executive order could go into effect in those states which hadn't challenged the executive order, meaning that we could have a patchwork across the country of places where there was protection and places where there wasn't for the president's mishandling of the Constitution. But I think, one of the things, as before the sunset on the day that the Supreme Court ruled, the ACLU actually filed a national class action lawsuit, which was another one of the mechanisms that the court said was still valid in order to get a nationwide injunction, was a national class action suit, which took into account folks situated in every state in the United States. We are hopeful that before this could go into effect anywhere, that the judge will rule on our motion for a temporary injunction in that case. And in fact, you won't see that patchwork, see this order go into effect.
All right, so Chuck Hernandez, what do you make of the Supreme Court's decision, not making a definitive decision on the order itself about birthright citizenship?
Yeah, I think it was still a victory for the Trump administration. The executive order, the title of it is The Meaning and the Value of Birthright Citizenship. What does citizenship mean in this country? And so we need to take a look at that, as our highest court needs to take a look at that, because the question is, has this been misapplied over the years? Has this been misapplied? Is citizenship should it automatically be granted to those who do not have citizenship, or to the children of those who do not have citizenship? There are people who come here illegally. There are people who overstay a temporary visa. They have a child. Should their children automatically be receiving citizenship? So this question still needs to be answered. But it was make no mistake, this was a great victory for Trump and his administration. This was a huge smackdown of rogue U.S. judicial, the district,
district court or
judges. They were overstepping their bounds.
So
they were overstepping their bounds.
Do you think once the plaintiffs have regrouped and figured out how they're going to pursue, do you think that this fight over birthright citizenship will make its way back to the Supreme Court?
Yeah, we ultimately seen that. We haven't received clarification yet on this matter. But what was clear is that these rogue judges cannot overstep their bounds.
The executive order also calls to revoke birthright citizenship from individuals who are here legally but not permanently. So, for example, a work visa or student visa. Why should that apply to them if they are in this country legally?
Are you saying, can you ask me
For
that
example, people who are immigrants and they are here legally, but not permanently. They are not necessarily students, but they are on a work visa or something like it that allows them to be here. Suppose they have a child while here. This executive order applies to those babies as well.
Yeah, sure. That's, if you look back in history, during the Great Depression, many Mexicans that were here on temporary work visas or here as temporary workers were sent back during the Great Depression when there was no work for them. They were sent back, and their children who were born here. Nobody made the case that those children were U.S. citizens.
Okay. Ed, the court made this ruling on June 27th. Enforcement begins 30 days from that date. What might that look like?
Well, again, hopefully we'll never reach that point. But what it could mean, for example, is that someone who is pregnant, who is looking to ensure that their child is a citizen in the city of Chicago, might not want to visit Indiana. We may see an influx of people come to a state like Illinois or California or Massachusetts or Washington State or one of the other states which is sued. Because they don't want to get in this entanglement of their child being born into another world. I want to say one thing about something that Chuck said about that we have to look at this issue. That would be great if we hadn't already looked at this issue for nearly 200 years. We looked at this in the specific language and the specific debate of the 14th Amendment. We looked at it in a case in 1898 that the Supreme Court decided on behalf of a Chinese student. And we've looked at it repeatedly over time in detailed statutory language that Congress has passed, recognizing that people who are born here are citizens. So there isn't anything to look at. This is simply a fever dream of Donald Trump and his white nationalist friends.
No, that is not true. That is not true.
Revisit this is just silly.
No, that is not true. What he's saying.
There wasn't an 1898 case.
No, I'm sorry. This 14th Amendment, the Citizenship Clause, was specifically referring to the children of and the descendants of slaves in our country. And part of it is, and you know the law, so you're just not being honest. Part of that law is very clear. You must be under the jurisdiction, not under another jurisdiction of another country. And anyone who is here temporarily or illegal is not under our jurisdiction. So guess what? They belong to another jurisdiction, and they are not to be granted U.S. citizenship, their children. And that's clear.
That question was raised. Raised in the debate over the language of the 14th Amendment, and it was made clear that it was. It was made clear before the Supreme Court in 1898, and it's been made clear before Congress on several occasions. This is simply, this idea of the under the jurisdiction clause somehow means people who aren't living here under the jurisdiction of the United States and somehow aren't under the jurisdiction of the United States because they aren't citizens just simply isn't true.
Chuck, I want to ask you this. What should make someone an American citizen if being born here is not enough?
It's very clear. It's very clear in the 14th Amendment. That's the Citizenship Clause. It says born on U.S. soil, but that's not the only thing. It says not under jurisdiction of another law. So if
Another
you're
nation.
a Mexican, right, or another nation, if you're Mexican, if you're Spanish, if you're Chinese, and you are not a U.S. citizen, you're here illegally, or you're here temporarily, you are not bound by our jurisdiction. You're bound by another country.
And just so our viewers know, we're looking at the 14th Amendment right now. Quote, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States.
Subject to the jurisdiction thereof. That has to be answered.
Ed, so before we let you go, just a few seconds left. Justice Sonia Sotomayor wrote in the dissent, the court's decision is nothing less than an open invitation for the government to bypass the Constitution. 20 seconds. What do you think she meant by that?
I think what she meant is that future presidents could see other things that they want to do, simply, sign an executive order that is clearly unconstitutional and then force it to be challenged in courts all across the country, expending a great deal of resources. It just invites this kind of mischief, and I think that's where the court got it wrong in this particular case.
Okay, a debate that is continuing. We've talked about it with both of you before. We will do it again in the future, I'm sure. Ed Yonka at the ACLU, Chuck Hernandez, Chicago Republican Party. Thanks to you both.
All right,
Thanks.
Up next, Chicago's iconic foods are inspiring a new snack line. Elements of Chicago culture are built on some of the city's most famous foods: deep dish pizza, Italian beef, and of course, the classic Chicago-style hot dog. Now, a local entrepreneur is putting all of those flavors in the bag and adding a little crunch to the city's food scene.
I love potato chips and I love Chicago food, and I thought it would be a really fun way to celebrate Chicago if we smashed the two things together.
That mashup led Laura Gardner and her husband David to create local-style potato chip.
We wanted the best chip base for this product. We didn't just want to make these taste like Chicago's famous foods. We wanted to put them on a kettle-cooked potato chip that would be downright delicious.
Cooking up the flavors was no challenge.
The flavors were almost the easy part to select, because when it comes to Chicago food, there's a holy trinity, and you've got Italian beef, and you've got Chicago hot dog, and you've got deep dish pizza.
And locals are already finding some fan favorites.
I was stunned by the hot dog flavor. I was like, this is like when they talk about like a Chicago style hot dog being like dragged through a garden. I was like, this is what it's like it's like a party in your mouth. It's so good.
But Gardner didn't stop there.
The hot jardinera I knew needed to be the next flavor after that. It's Chicago's best kept secret.
Those best kept secrets are just some of what makes local style so flavorful.
I love the logo. I love the illustrations, which are so fun.
Chicago food is so much more than just the food. We wanted to give it a personality, like walking on a happy, bright Chicago summer day. Like that was sort of the feeling we were going for.
The cartoon designs and creative flavors are popping up across Chicago's neighborhoods.
We started in 7 and we've already grown to 17, which has been a whirlwind 3.5 weeks. That just goes to show that when like Chicago gets behind something, like we can grow.
Gardner chose the first few locations to carry her product based on her history with the city.
I've lived in the West Loop, I've lived up in Old Town, I've lived in a handful of places, and I really chose my favorite spots. Like there wasn't much strategy to it.
But her first stop was inspired by her love of a popular Chicago show that also pays homage to the city's vibrant food scene.
I walked into Mr. Beef very nervous and was holding my chips in my arms, and I asked if the owner was here. Chris looked at the chips and he tasted the chips and fell in love with them. And the best case scenario in my head that day was that Mr. Beef would carry the chips. That was all that was on my mind. And it actually went further than that. And Chris shared the chips with his buddies and his friends at the Bear. So my very first paying customer was the Bear craft services team, which is just incredible and something I'm so grateful for.
And Gardner has plans to take her Chicago-style chips even further.
I think we definitely want to expand the line, asking on social media, what flavors do you guys want? We're already getting some really great social comments and ideas thrown our way, and we're like, gosh, do people really want a Malort flavor? Like, don't dare us, like, we'll do it.
And she's taking pride in representing her adopted hometown.
I feel really proud to be bringing this to the city. I think taking our famous foods and putting them on such a fun snack like a potato chip is something that the city feels excited about, and I feel really proud to be bringing it to the city. And yeah, just very excited to see how far Chicago can take local style chips.
Looks delicious. Head to our website for details on where you can find local style potato chips around town. And that's our show for this Monday night. Stay connected with our newsroom by following us on Instagram at WTTW Chicago. And join us tomorrow night at 5:30 and special time 11. Now for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Brandis Friedman. Thanks for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm that contributes to public safety policy and guidelines.